Next up, a presentation from Patrick Worms, the president of the International Union for Agroforestry.
Oliver, your audience might remember that I'm really into nature-based solutions, right? I'm an agroforester. I work as a science policy advisor for a big research organization called World Agroforestry. I am the president of something called the International Union of Agroforestry, and I helped set up, and I'm still the vice president of the European Agroforestry Federation. And the reason I do that is not only because it's really fun to watch things grow, but also because watching things grow well is such a giant help in managing the consequences of our carbon greed. Because let's face it, we all love our carbon, don't we? So perhaps I can start by explaining what I mean by this and how important this is, and just launch into a presentation. How about that? Buffering the climate is what we've got to play at, right? And the reason we've got to play at that is because we have been so absolutely lousy at doing anything about our carbon emissions. We've been talking about it since the 1990s. We've realized this was a problem since the 1860s. But while we've talked about it, we've done very, very little to stop putting long-lived greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the reason for that, as this chart shows, is everybody's getting on the fossil fuel bandwagon because fossil fuels are great. They heat your house, they give you food, they allow you to travel, they give you entertainment, they make life a place of pleasure and comfort that the kings of yore might never have noticed. But of course, what we know here is that this is a massive problem. And it's a problem that leads, in the European context, to all of the disasters that seem to have come hot on the heels one after another this summer. The floods in Greece, for example, followed soon after by the floods in Libya. The various forest fires that have been striking the Mediterranean from Portugal in the west to Cyprus in the east. The storms. And the only good picture I found was a picture from 2009, just to remind us that this is not a new problem. We've known that these issues are going to be massive issues, and we've known it for a long time. We also know that agriculture, so often portrayed as a solution to these issues, is actually part of the problem, right? Because it consumes an enormous amount of land and water, and it employs a huge number of people, and it generates a large number of greenhouse gases, all while generating less than 5% of global wealth. Yes, it's the global wealth that feeds our bodies, so it's the global wealth that we love having in the fridge and on the dinner table, but it is nevertheless a broken industry. And it's a broken industry that has a direct impact on the planet. When we think of land degradation, for example, we tend to think of areas like the ones in Africa, areas that look like this, areas that are desertified and in which we expect people to have difficulty feeding themselves. But that would be mistaken, because in practice, land degradation is affecting every part of the planet, including the rich soils of the American Midwest, the Brazilian Cerrado, the Chinese floodplain, and Ukraine. This is what that looks like, that kind of land degradation. It's a big modern farming system, but the guy plowed his land and prepared his seedbed just before there was some wind and the soil is blowing away. Or he planted his crops and wanted a little bit of rain to harvest his crops, but with climate change, the rain increasingly turns into storms, and so your soil is being washed away. And when you look at how much impact that has on the climate itself, you come up with figures that range from 20 to 30%, sometimes even 40%, depending on how you do your calculations. It's difficult to understand exactly how much carbon agriculture is putting into the air, but we all agree it's a lot. The beautiful news is none of that is necessary. We can grow all the food we need while locking down carbon and while fixing our deleterious impacts on soils. We can fix this. And fixing it is not terribly complicated. You don't need big tractors and GMOs and the latest chemistry and all of that stuff. You only need two things: the management of trees and the management of livestock. And sometimes that means the management of livestock in trees. So let's see what that means. Let's see what these good agricultural systems look like. They boil down into four categories. The so-called silvopastoral systems. Those are the systems where you mix livestock with trees. And clockwise from top left, what you have here are examples from Poland, where this guy is running milch cows under his apple orchard. From Finland, where the reindeer are munching on the lichen in the winter. From Ceylon, from Burkina Faso, where the cattle are eating the stover, the leftover material from the crops, under these shea trees, and we all use shea either in our beauty products or in our chocolate. There's a lot of shea in chocolate. And at the bottom left, the Pata Negra pigs that are running in the cork oak savannas of Portugal. So all of these systems are called silvopastoral because they are pastured animals under trees. Then you have the silvo-arable systems. Arable means farming and silvo means trees, so logically enough, these are the systems where you put trees in farmlands. And again, from clockwise from top left, what you have are examples of a maize field in Zambia with trees that are legumes. They fix nitrogen, so they provide fertilizer to the maize. At the top right, you have an example of an energy crop, that coppice tree on the right in alleys in England. At the bottom right, you have an agroforestry system in Sri Lanka, where the agroforestry component are the small shrubby things and the crop are the big tall things, the coconuts. And at the bottom left, you have a silvo-arable system with wheat and poplars in France. What they all have in common is that the trees are helping the crops to grow and protect them from extreme weather, and the crops help the trees to grow. And so suddenly you have two different things growing from your land that you can sell. The third and the most important the most effective of these agricultural systems are the polycultures. They are also the most difficult to make work in the modern world, because instead of growing one crop or one crop and one tree, you're growing 17 or 20 different things on a given plot of land. It's really, really, really complex. It's really, really, really effective in terms of using ecosystem services to put carbon in the soil, to get biodiversity back, and to grow a lot of high quality stuff. But it's really, really difficult to make work in a market system, because the guy who's turning up with his crop to collect your, your bananas is not going to be interested in your vanilla. So in here, from the top left, we have the chaga gardens on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. We have a modern oil palm agroforestry system in Brazil. At the bottom right, we have a modern keyline system in New York State. And at the bottom left, we have a coffee, banana, vanilla, jatropha, and I forget what else, system in Uganda. All of these systems are really, really impactful. And those amongst your listeners who understand permaculture will recognize that permaculture resembles a lot like this. Permaculture is a form of polyculture, which is ideally adapted to the production of high-value goods, such as fruits and vegetables. Now, the fourth system, I don't have an illustration for because it would get us off into a beautiful rabbit hole, but we don't have the time, and those are the grasslands. Grasslands, well managed, are a crucial part of managing the planet. But what we have now is a framework, a mental framework to understand what we can do. And if we look at how powerful they are, we can simply look at these charts. Here, for example, is the measured sequestration rate, the amount of carbon being locked down by a poplar agroforestry system on a so-called 30-year rotation. You let your trees grow for 30 years, you cut them, you plant them again. And what you see is that as the trees grow, they capture a huge amount of carbon. They're putting carbon in the soil and they're capturing carbon in their bodies, in their wood. If then you turn that poplar into timber to build a house, that carbon is locked away for decades, maybe centuries. Of course, if you turn it into toilet paper, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere soon enough as the toilet paper runs away in a sewage plant. But you already see the idea of how trees are helping to capture down carbon. And so if you look at at what that could give if you do it at scale, and this is a simple system. It's one type of tree, poplars, planted in one type of farming system, arable. And this is the annual increment in carbon it could lock down year after year after year. It varies between 150 and 250 million tons of CO2, and that's just for the UK. And the UK is just one small island on the size of this planet. That gives you some idea of the potential that agroforestry has. And how widely could you spread agroforestry? How big could it be? Well, just look at this map. What it does is it shows you the density of tree cover on agricultural lands across Europe. Red means there is no trees. You really have to squint to see a little bit of green in southern Italy, in southern Spain and Portugal, in the mountainous area of central France. Each and every one of these fields could benefit from having trees on them. And I don't just mean that they could benefit us, the wider public, by helping to draw down carbon. I mean that they could benefit the farmers themselves, because trees help farming work better. And what I'm going to do now is just explain very simply why trees are so important. And when you think about it, it's obvious. For example, trees have much deeper roots than crops. That means that they can suck up nutrients from deep in the soil, build their bodies and their leaves with it. And then in winter, in autumn, when the leaves fall down and rot, the nutrients that the tree pumped from deep in the soil is available at the surface of the field and therefore becomes available to crops. So having a tree in your field is like having a fertilizer factory in your field. Then, especially as we get these increasing droughts and these increasing storms, trees are really good at buffering things. We all know that it's wetter and cooler under a tree when there's a drought. What we may not realize is that trees are giant rain-catching devices. When there's a storm, all that water runs along the branches, the trunk, and the roots of the trees and gets stored underground instead of rushing off in a big sheet into the nearest river. So it's a flood control measure too. And we've measured that at scale. And we've noticed that it's when you have this intermediate tree density, not too many trees as in a forest or not too few trees as in a degraded landscape, that you have the most water recharge in the ground. And that's what this chart shows. The red arrow pointing up is the amount of rainwater that's intercepted and transpired again by the plants. And obviously, the more trees you have, the more of this transpiration you have. The yellow arrow pointing up is the amount of evaporation you have from the soil. And obviously, the fewer trees you have, the more evaporation you have. The surface runoff, the orange arrow pointing to the left, shows that the less trees you have, the less obstacles you have to water simply running away, and you have more and more water running off. What's interesting to us, because we've got all these aquifers that are being pumped dry by our farming system, is how we can encourage most of them, the maximum amount of that water to come back down. And that's the blue arrow pointing down. In the forests, you don't have a lot of water recharge because the trees use up all the water and transpire it again. In the degraded land, you don't have a lot of recharge because it mostly evaporates away or runs off into the river. But in the intermediate tree cover land, the agroforestry landscapes, that's where you maximize groundwater recharge, right? It also helps deal with the pollution of fertilizers. A big problem that you have in places like the US or Europe, or now increasingly Brazil, is that excess fertilizer runs off into the rivers or into the groundwater supplies, and it's difficult to get rid of. It's a pollutant that's bad in drinking water, so it's bad for babies and pregnant women. It's just a bit of a hassle. And the best way of getting rid of it is to use less of it. The second best way of getting rid of it is to have an agroforestry system. Because if you look at the little drawing at the bottom in the agroforestry system, the tree roots go under the crop roots. And all the fertilizer that the crops didn't use gets absorbed by the trees. And that's why you find in the blue bar that the agroforestry system has much less leaching of nitrogen than the red bar, which is the pure agricultural system. I told you a while ago that the crops protect the trees. Well, here's an example. Here's what happens when you do real hard science in agroforestry. You dig all around your tree and you count the number of rootlets. And that gives you this kind of graph. On the left, you have a graph that shows you the density, the root density, meaning the meters of rootlets per cubic meter of soil by depth. The deeper you go, the fewer roots you have. In the agroforestry system on the right, most of the rootlets are between 1.5 and 3 meters down. because close to the surface, there's no room. The crop roots are using it. So when you have a drought in the forestry system, the tree stops growing. There's no more water. In the agroforestry system, the tree keeps growing because down deep at 1.5, 2 meters, there's still water even when there's a drought near the surface. And it's because of all of these impacts, and because they are so ignored, that when I see a picture like this, I go, good Lord, we have to educate our farmers. Because this picture, which comes from the website of a big agrochemical company, is supposed to suggest how bounteous, how productive your field is going to be if you use their products. Instead, once you understand how agroecosystems work, you see a an early summer landscape in Europe, probably 14 to 16 hours of sunlight, which is not used. There's no photosynthesis. It rains in the summer in Europe. That water is not used either. At least in this system, when you harvest your arable crops, you continue using sun and water. And that's why the land equivalency ratio, the amount of land that you need to have the same productivity as 1 hectare of agroforestry by monocropping your crops and by monocropping your forest, is always larger than what you get in agroforestry. And that's raw cash. Farmers make more money from agroforestry. Now, why is that so useful from a climate change perspective? It's because incentives make the world go round. Farmers are not going to plant trees if it's going to cost them money. But we want farmers to plant trees, not only because of the carbon that locks down, but also because good management is a protection against climate change. Here is a fire that killed over 100 people in Portugal a few years ago. It burned in land that was abandoned and not managed. These lands, which were just 10 kilometers away, which are managed as a silvopastoral system, when the fire turns up there, nothing much happens. It's only the grass that burns. The trees don't burn because there's no shrubs. There's no fuel on the ground. Here's what happened in that French storm I told you about. So many trees were destroyed by the winds that they had become valueless. The sawmills couldn't keep up. This is a picture taken of an agroforestry system, a silvo-arable system, in the same area the next summer, 6 months later. As you'll notice, there's not a single gap in those tree lines. Why? The trees have much deeper roots. They are squatter. They can resist the wind, which a plantation can't. And these kind of landscapes can easily disappear if you remember what our ancestors did, which is to plant hedges. Because hedges diminish wind speeds. They capture sediment that's flying across the air. They keep the soil in place. And the same thing happens for this kind of erosion. All you have to do is use key lines to help them to slow down the water and help the water deposit its sediments. Now, do you want to take my word for it? No. Take the word of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. Because what the IPCC is saying is that these principles, which all together are known as agroecology, farming that works with natural processes, they rock. They support food security, nutrition, health, well-being, livelihoods, biodiversity, sustainability, and ecosystem services. And then if you're a scientist, you love these 2 words in parentheses there, high confidence. High confidence simply means they've looked at thousands of scientific papers, and the consensus is overwhelming that this works. But that then leads us to a question. If this is the future, why does the world look like this more and more? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is, yes, we're clever animals, but we still like to divide things up into smaller bits and pieces to manage them. So we've got ministries of agriculture and ministries of forestry and ministries of environment and ministries of finance. But the world doesn't look like that. In the world, all these bits and pieces are mixed up, and the nutrients, the water, the genes, everything flows. It's a life dynamic system. The next problem we have, especially in Europe, is labor is really expensive, social security costs and all the extra income taxes that people have to pay. But borrowing money is cheap. Even today, when interest rates are much higher than they were a couple of years ago, it's still much, much cheaper to borrow money to buy a tractor than to pay some workers. Then we all love progress, right? We don't like the old ways. But the old ways mixed up the shops and the producers and the housing and the factories, whereas the new ways put everything into their own little corner. Factories over here, education over there, housing here, all connected by roads needing petrol, gas, and cars. And by the way, this wasn't just an issue for the capitalist world, this was an issue for the communist world as well. This is a poster from Soviet times showing how great Soviet agriculture is. There's no green in it, there's no animals in it, there's just a fertilizer factory and an army of tractors marching proudly into the future. Then another reason is, yes, we are clever animals, but even as adults, we sometimes behave like toddlers. You know what it's like? Those of you who have children know that when they are 4 or 5 years old and you put the presents at Christmas under the tree and they open that present, they will not play with their old toys evermore. They will just play with their new present. They forget what they already have. And we were the same. We found these wonderful tools, fertilizers, pesticides, mechanized agriculture. These are powerful tools. Just imagine how powerful they are. You have a pest problem, you spray something, it's gone. For thousands of years, pest problems meant lower crops. Sometimes they meant famine. Suddenly, all you had to do was spray a cheap chemical on it, and it's gone. Fertilizer. Just imagine the labor of carrying fertilizer in the form of manure around and growing your food. Now, all you have to do is pour it out of a bag. These are extraordinarily powerful tools. And I'm glad we have them. But we behave like toddlers. We forgot the old tools we have. And that's leading to problems. It's also leading to a problem of influence. These tools are cheap, but because they work so well, you can sell them to hundreds of millions of farmers around the world. So you make a huge pile of cash. Whereas advising people to manage their trees and their livestock better, that makes less cash. And that means with all of that cash that they have, they can do more marketing, they can do more lobbying, they can buy more influence, they can do more research, and their market is growing year after year after year. And it's leading to insidious things like the feed the world thing. Oh my God, we've got climate change and our populations are growing. We need to grow 70% more food to feed everybody or we'll have mass starvation. And what that means is we need to increase global calorie production. So we can only do that really on large farms with big tractors and specialized seeds and better fertilizers. In other words, we have a discourse that is geared to kicking small farmers off the land, to kicking agroecology of the land, and to replace it with more of the same, on the mistaken, at least bizarre assumption that you can fix the problem of modern agriculture by doing more modern agriculture. However, even with all of that, they are losing. They are losing. And the reason they are losing is because farmers are not stupid. Farmers know trees are important. And already today, we know that over 40% of all agricultural land on the planet has more than 10% tree cover, and that's rising year after year. Yes, it's rising slowly, but it is rising, not diminishing. And again, the scientists, they know it too. If in agriculture, you want to do something to boost mitigation and adaptation and reduce desertification and reduce land degradation and increase food security, what can you do apart from increased food productivity, which is like asking mummy for more pocket money? What you can do is use agroforestry. It's the cheapest and most effective tool we have at our disposal. I didn't talk about grazing, but improved grazing management delivers almost as well. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I am an optimist. It is because not only do we have the tools that we need to manage our agro-ecosystems, suck down carbon and make them more resilient to the increasingly dire weather conditions we are getting, but these tools are either cheap or they make farmers money. And the only reason they're not spreading more rapidly is because we live in an environment in which the people who dominate the discourse are the people who sell the chemicals. But even they are beginning to realize that simply more chemicals is not going to be enough. So we are at the cusp of a revolution in agroecology, in the management of our landscapes. And I'm convinced that by the time my children reach my age, the farming landscapes of the world will look completely different to what they look like today. Thank you.